Our reading today is from Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4 through 14. These are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders of the exiles and the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon: build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage. They may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to the dreams that they dream. For it is a lie that they are prophesying to you in my name. I did not send them, declares the Lord. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes and gather you from the nations and all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place which I sent you into exile.
That was awesome, Nate. Fantastic job. You pray with me for a moment. Jesus, we thank you that you're here in this place. We thank you for all the work that your Spirit has done in the lives of our kids and the volunteers this past week at Sky Kids. God, we thank you for our children and the voice that they can be for us, the inspiration that they can be. Jesus, I pray that in these next few moments you would just inspire us with your word. Jesus, that there would not be one word that comes out of my mouth that is not from you, and that you would just direct those words to our hearts and to our minds. Guide our thoughts, our feelings, and our reactions, God, towards your Spirit. Be with us in this place. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Good morning. I'm Jake. I'm one of the pastors here, and I know I'm really excited for the kids to come back up here in like 40 minutes, and they're going to sing for us and share some of their Sky Kids moment. And so that, I feel like we're heading in that direction. So I'll try to be brief so we can get back to the kids. A couple of years ago, I found myself at a conference. And I was getting ready to go to one of the main sessions. And at ministry conferences, these main room gatherings, they tend to have names that are very recognizable. So it's Francis Chan's of the world and Andy Stanley's, and it's leaders within the Christian world that you are just like, I am in that room, and I cannot wait to take in their wisdom. And as I was getting ready for this one particular session, the speaker was a name that I had no idea who she was. And I'll be honest, without the name recognition at the time, I began to question if I had some other options. Should I take this time to rest and just relax? And in hindsight, I'm glad I went, because it ended up being one of the most profound, thought-provoking sessions that I've ever attended. And so I'm sitting in the session, and this woman gets introduced. Her name is Phyllis Tickle. And so this grandmotherly type woman gets up, which at a youth ministry conference, which is what it was at the time, is not usually the demographic that's up on stage. But she was so inspiring and so compelling. And come to find out, she's one of the most influential writers of our time. She's won numerous Lifetime Achievement Awards, and some credit her as being one of the people on the forefront of getting religion and Christianity writing into mainstream conversations. And what she started to talk through was some research that she had done about the way that the world works, specifically in regards to the way Christianity has developed. And so she shared with us that about every 500 years, the church feels compelled to hold a giant rummage sale. In other words, what she was saying, that according to history, every 500 years, Christianity kind of goes through this reevaluation process, this transition, this transformation to evaluate who are we, where are we, and how are we being most effective in the world that we find ourselves. And then she started to actually go through the history, and it became pretty apparent pretty quickly that she knows what she's talking about. Because obviously, if you go to the beginning of Christianity the way we know it, Jesus kind of changed things, right? That was a huge transformation for what Judaism was and the way religion was being practiced at the time, and that was right around 27 to 30. And then shortly thereafter, at 476, the fall of Rome completely changed the landscape once again. Up until that point, Christianity and Rome had kind of been hand in hand. Church and state were one, and they were completely unified. But then all of a sudden, when these Germanic barbarians came in and Rome was overthrown, the church had to completely rethink how it was operating. And there was this power vacuum that happened. Now, all of a sudden, evangelism to these barbarians, which had been on the back burner, now had to shift to the forefront because it was the barbarians who were running the world now. So then Christianity plugged along, and again, about 500 years later, 1054, is this event called the Great Schism. Christendom became divided. There was one holy Catholic church at that point on the calendar until 1054, where Pope Leo IX excommunicated the entire half of the Eastern Church. And then the Eastern Church, they returned the favor. And so now all of a sudden, the unthinkable was happening, that when there was one church, now there were two divided groups of people. You go another 500 years to 1517, and you get to the place that maybe a lot more of us are very familiar with, the Great Reformation. Martin Luther and his 95 Theses. This influence and the importance of Scripture being risen, and that the Scriptures would not be in just the language of the priest, but in the language of the people, and that we would be able to have Bibles in our hands to read and engage with Scripture. We owe a lot to where we are today from all of these, but a lot to the Reformation. And so once again, Christianity shifted, the priorities shifted, the emphasis shifted. And so, of course, as she kind of walked through this, it landed to that point of, if it's every 500 years, we're sitting right on that line right now. And there's been a lot written in the last 20 years as far as like, where is this thing going? And I'll just say, nobody knows fully. But there's a lot of people asking questions and trying to discern what's really been happening. And I think we could probably all quickly agree it feels a little different being Christians today within the culture that we find ourselves in than it did 20 years ago, 40 years ago. The landscape has shifted. And I really like the summary from the pastor in New York named John Tyson, where he talks about there are three cultural shifts that have been taking place that have impacted Christianity. And the first one is that Protestant Christianity, it shifted from being the majority to now the minority. All of a sudden, it's not the loudest voice in the room anymore. It's not the popular opinion anymore. Secondly, Christianity has shifted from the center of culture to now on the fringe. Now it's like Christians seem to find ourselves on the outside, trying to figure out how we fit in and how we can speak in and what's happening there. And then thirdly, Christians have shifted from culturally respected to maybe being more disrespected. And I think we see this within media. How often is it that Christians, in the way that we're portrayed within news and in interviews, it's usually not very respected. I know as a Christian myself, sometimes I'm more embarrassed about the public display of Christianity than I might always want to admit. And so we have shifted, and it's created tensions. And it's tensions I've felt. I know it's tensions that you have felt. I remember growing up as a kid, my dad being a pastor, I hated the "what does your dad do for work" question. I would try to avoid that because it was like every time it came up and I'd be like, oh, he's a pastor, and then it would be met with laughter or questions or bullying. And honestly, it's something that I still feel in myself today. I'll be at a party in our neighborhood and meeting people that I don't know, and they're like, "What do you do?" And there's like almost a pause. I'm like, okay, how are they going to respond to this? And I tend to find that you either get shock, which I think is a compliment, where people are like, "You're a pastor? No way! Like, that's crazy." And so I think that's a good thing. I think. But then the other side of it is that it gets awkward and, all of a sudden the conversation kind of dies and they turn and they walk away to someone else and go off to another conversation. Remember in high school, I used to be asked what religion I was, and I'd always say I'm Baptist. Because it was just, it would kill the conversation. They'd look at me confused and that's not a religion. I'm like, I know, I'm clever. And, And so I'm sure that you all have some similar stories. You go to work on Monday and it's like, hey, what'd you do this weekend? Are you sharing about church? Are you not? When things are happening in the workplace or in social gatherings and, certain directions are being taken in the conversation and you're left wrestling with, do I participate? Do I not? Do I call them on something? Do I mention I'm a Christian? And so being in these places creates this tension, which leads us to a question. How do we authentically follow Jesus in the culture that we find ourselves in? And the Bible calls this question exile. Exile is this theme that we see throughout the scriptures. Early on in Genesis, Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden. The Old Testament seems to just repeatedly go back to this. It's just the Israelites are almost always on the verge of going into exile, are actually in exile, or are coming out of exile, and then it seems like this cycle is starting over again. But what's important to understand is that the theme of exile isn't just in the Old Testament, but we find it in the New Testament as well. Peter actually starts his letter this way: to God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces. So Peter is writing to this group of Christians who are spread all throughout Asia Minor. And he's addressing how they're supposed to be living as people in exile. See, exile for the scriptures, it's not just a physical reality, but it is actually a spiritual reality. What Peter is getting at as he introduces this letter is that as followers of Jesus, regardless of our citizenship, our ethnicity, our backgrounds, we at times will have the felt experience in our culture of one of exile. This is not our home. Our home is with Christ. Our home is the kingdom of heaven. Paul calls us ambassadors, and so we find ourselves, as we follow Jesus, as people with one foot in two different worlds. And that's what the life of exile is, and that's what our whole series for the next few weeks is going to be covering. We're calling it Life in Babylon. How do we live and thrive in exile? And today we're going to look at Jeremiah's letter to the exiles, having just gone into Babylon. And then over the next few weeks, we're going to unpack the book of Daniel, which follows a group of Judite leaders as they live in these two worlds of Babylonian culture and yet trying to maintain their identity as children of God. And we're going to see what we can learn from being in that tension. And so for this morning, I want to just ask the simple question of how do we actually respond to being in exile? And I think there are three different postures that we can find ourselves choosing from as being people in exile. The first posture is one of resistance. It's kind of a separation. And you see this within Jeremiah's letter. In verse 16, just after where our reading was today, you kind of see that somehow there was almost a choice in the matter. As Jeremiah writes to these people, that there are a group of Judahites that have stayed in Jerusalem. They've appointed a new king, and they're dwelling there. They're living in Jerusalem, despite the fact that the temple was just destroyed, despite that their homes were burned down. It's like this group of people were just insisting that even though God is bringing them into exile, God is behind this, they just refuse and resist to go. We're not going to settle. We're not going. We're going to separate. And so this response of resisting can be described as flight. In a lot of ways, it's living life in a bubble. It's choosing to just completely stay out of our culture An extreme example of this would be an Amish community within our culture today. Being a group of people that we're going to set up our own place of living, our own culture. We're going to stay separate. We're not going to have the internet and certain amenities because we need to just keep ourselves pure and set apart. For those of us in this room, this would be only having Christian friends, only talking with people that think the same way, that read the same books, that have the exact same thinking that you do. It's only listening to Christian music, and it's protecting ourselves and putting this bubble around ourselves. But then there's another response. If that is the flight response of resistance and separating, the other side we can call the fight response. And again, we see this within the passage from Jeremiah. So there were this group of prophets that were among the people who had gone into exile, and these prophets were taking a posture of aggressively and actively resisting what was happening. And specifically, they were telling all the exiles, this is going to be over quick. It's going to be 2 years, tops. Chapter 28 has one of these prophets, Hananiah, saying that God is going to break the yoke of the king of Babylon. And so they're saying, don't put down roots, don't integrate, don't get involved in this culture because we're out of here. And so there are these preachers on the street corners that are aggressively going on after the culture in Babylon. And so if the resisting flight method is the bubble around us, this is actively going around and popping the bubbles. This is becoming the cultural police. It's complaining about the decline of morality. It's angry posts on Facebook. It's aggressively and actively going against the culture. In some regards, the flight mode is completely separating and disappearing from it. This one is sticking out like a sore thumb in the opposite direction. So the question with that posture, though, is can we actually influence culture by resisting it? The flight mentality is often motivated by fear, and unfortunately it leaves us absent from culture. We are left hoping, praying that somebody breaks into that bubble and takes things that we have set up for ourselves and brings that back. Now, God can do that. But I'd say more often than not, that doesn't happen. More often than not, when we resist and fully separate like that, we're simply left to ourselves. On the flip side, the fight mentality often is characterized by anger and bitterness. Perhaps many of you have heard it explained today that Christians today are more known for what we're against than what we're for. We're known as angry and judgmental and bitter and loud and not willing to listen versus the love of Jesus. And so does either method really influence culture in a positive and a forward-moving kind of a way? The next posture that we could choose is the opposite extreme, and that's one of submission. This is when we just take on the attitude of, well, when in Rome, act like the Romans. So the fact of the matter for the Judahites, Babylon was a great place. It was the epicenter of its time. It was the world power of its day. This was like New York City, LA, London. I mean, this was like restaurants in every corner. It would have been really easy for these Judahites to just kind of go, hey, this might actually be better for us. Jerusalem was great, but man, this is Babylon. There's a lot to offer here. And unfortunately, you end up seeing this as well within the narrative of exile. The book of Nehemiah talks about the exile after it is over and the people coming back. And chapter 7 of Nehemiah specifically talks about the people that come out of captivity, the exiles who decide to come back to Jerusalem. And it's one of these really fun portions of Scripture, you know, the ones with all the names and the numbers that's like 2 pages long that you're just going to, can't even pronounce half of those. I'm just going to skip it and move on. But what's powerful about this list is that this list of names in Nehemiah is like a memorial wall. These are the group of people that after 70 years, 4 generations of living, chose to walk away from home because they remembered who they really were. that their identities were still Judahites, which unfortunately means that there was a whole other group of people that in the process of that exile gave up being an Israelite, but gave up their home in Jerusalem and became Babylonians. And so they just submitted to the culture around them. Barna Research Group did a study a number of years ago that they expressed that unfortunately for most Christians, our lives don't look any different than our non-Christian neighbors. This is probably the posture that most of us probably struggle with the most. And unfortunately, it leaves us in an odd place. Going back to Peter, Peter later on in his letter talks about always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks about the hope that you have. So Peter is writing to this group of Christians in exile, reminding them that you are a person who has one foot in both worlds. Don't forget your real identity. And as you live in that way, be prepared for when the non-Christians of the day are coming up to you and saying, hey, you see things differently. You have something that I don't have. Can we talk about that? And so the question becomes is if we are submitting to the culture, if we're blending in, if our lives don't look any different than our neighbors, is anyone ever going to ask you to describe the hope that you have if the hope looks no different than theirs? And so again, how does that actually impact culture? And once again, God can use that, but I don't think it's the most effective way. Instead, I think what scriptures invite us into, what I think Jesus models for us, is this third posture, this third way of engaging with the culture around us, and it's what we're going to call redemptive participation. And verses 5 through 7 of the text really set this up. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Put yourself in the mindset of these Judahites. Temple destroyed. That is the center of their religion. That is the place that God hung out. God's presence was taken from them. Their homes are destroyed. Their fields are destroyed. The land that they had been living in for generations, the place and the land that God had promised them, was gone. And so here they are, probably in tents, living in this strange city, wrestling with feelings of probably anger and bitterness and grief, feeling like God had abandoned them, and asking what's next. And then here comes this letter from this prophet who's almost telling them to have a normal life. It's like, go build a house, go to Whole Foods. Hey, actually eat the food that you bring back from Whole Foods. Get on a dating app. Start a relationship. Start a family. Have kids. And it just was so countercultural to the way that they were probably thinking. I mean, for our kind of mindset, think about like zombie apocalypse happens tomorrow. You're probably not thinking about, how can I put down roots right now? And let me think about raising a child and bringing a child into this chaos. Like that's not on our minds, right? But that's what Jeremiah is encouraging the people. But if that's not shocking enough, Jeremiah then goes into this even more uncomfortable place because he says, seek the welfare of this city. Pray to the Lord on its behalf. Wait a minute, Jeremiah. The people who just burned my house down, you want me to seek their welfare? You want me to pray for them? What's even more fascinating is Jeremiah 3 times in his letters so far has said not to pray for Jerusalem. And then now he's telling us to pray for Babylon? And there's one commentary to suggest that this would have been so countercultural that there was almost a suggestion that, like, did the scribe change this before the letter made it to us? Like, this is just so out of character and so crazy. Like, this cannot be what we're supposed to be doing. And yet within the text, there's something that we miss in our English translations that's really, really important, because that term welfare is the ever important Hebrew term of shalom. Seek the shalom of the city where I have sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its shalom you will find your shalom. Shalom literally means peace, but it's so much deeper than the way that we just, throw out that word casually about wanting peace in this world. Shalom was an all-encompassing, holistic sense of peace, socially, physically, economically, spiritually. It represented wholeness. And it was a charge that the Jewish people had been living with for generations upon generations upon generations, that they would be seeking the shalom of God, and that they would be actively engaging in bringing the shalom of God in the world around them. And so in this countercultural, not obvious kind of command that Jeremiah has for the people, it's almost like he's telling them, don't lose what's different about you. Keep your feet in both worlds. You've been on a mission to bring shalom into the world. You are partnering in the story of God to bring shalom to all things. That hasn't changed. Don't hide that. Don't give it up. And instead actually use your differences in this season of life. I love what Gabe Lyons says about this. Our mission in redemptive participation is to infuse the world with beauty, grace, justice, and love, to envision the world as it was meant to be and work toward that vision, to not separate from the world or blend in, rather to thoughtfully engage. We want to take a posture that's going to further the conversation. The flight method of resisting and just the submitting to the culture eliminates the conversation altogether. The fight version of resisting the culture almost tends to end the conversation, or it makes it very one-sided. But I think what Jesus modeled was to live in a different way, to live in a way, as Peter said, that people would approach us and say, can you explain that hope that you have, because I want that. We have to remember that Jesus was in exile as well. Jesus left his home of heaven. Jesus left the comfort of just being with God and being in the heavens and being separate, and Jesus took on flesh and blood and walked in our shoes and showed us how to live. And I really believe that Jesus had no intention of starting a religion or an institution. Jesus wanted to invite us into a way of life that was going to be life to the fullest, that was going to give us joy, that was going to continue to participate in redeeming and reclaiming and restoring all things. Living in a redemptive, participatory way is praying the prayer that we pray every single week together, and that we're going to pray in just a few moments. Your kingdom come on earth, in Greenwich, in Darien, in Westchester, as it is in heaven. Now, and honestly, this third way, it's harder, unfortunately. It's a lot easier to just resist, or a lot easier to just submit. Though it's clearer. This third way actually begins a lot more conversations. There's a lot more tension that can sometimes come up in this conversation because you're constantly navigating both worlds. And so there's a lot of dialogue behind it. But I also think that that's part of the beauty of exile. We have to remember that this life of exile, when we find ourselves in a different culture than the one that we might be picking for ourselves, that God is behind that. God is sending these people into exile. What I found fascinating this week, the Hebrew word for exile can also be translated as to uncover, discover, reveal, open, or appear. There is something that happens within exile. when we thoughtfully engage with it, that actually widens, that actually opens, that actually brings more life into something. And that's what Jeremiah 29:11 is really getting at. It's one of the most quoted verses in scriptures, but unfortunately, it's most often quoted well out of context. And as a former youth pastor, I used to sign kids' graduation cards for high school with this verse. And then all of a sudden studying it more, and I'm like, oh, this is all about your life is going to be miserable for 70 years. Then things are going to get better. I don't want to put that hope on these kids graduating. And I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for shalom and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. As hard as it is to be people in exile, as hard as it is at times to navigate these two worlds, as hard as it can be to wrestle with our identity, that's where we find the hope. That's where we find shalom. That's where we'll find future. What most excited me about what Phyllis Tickle had shared about these 500-year rotations, in every single 500 years, Christianity kind of reshaping itself, was she pointed out at the end of her talk that every time that the faith has spread dramatically as a result of what happens, every single shift, every season of exile that the church has gone through has resulted in increasing the range and the depth of the church's reach. And so, yes, exile is hard. Figuring out how do we authentically follow Jesus in the culture that we find ourselves in is struggle, but it's actually not a problem to solve. It's an opportunity to engage in. This 500-year cycle for me, it excited me. We are on the cusp of things shifting again, and we as a church, as a community, Christianity as a whole, get to be part of what the next 500 years look like. Being a people in exile now, and as uncomfortable as we will find ourselves in, we get to be legacy setters. And as that might overwhelm, that really excites me, and that gives me hope for where we're going. And so we're going to dig in to this concept over the next few weeks and talk about vocation and talk about relationships and talk about our communities and how we actually do this and engage in deeper ways. But for today, I kind of want to just leave us with a few questions. Just first off, what posture have you been living in already? Just honestly ask, have you been resisting? Have you been separating yourself? Have you been embarrassed about your faith and keeping it inside? Have you been submitting to it? Have you just been along for the ride? If you are honest today, would you say your life looks any different than your non-Christian neighbor or coworkers? And if that's you, no guilt, no shame in that, but just the follow-up question is, how's that been working for you? And just ask that honestly. And then lastly, just super practically, as we think about engaging the world in this third way, what would it look like for you this week, tomorrow, as you go to work, as you go to school, as you're hanging with friends, as you're at the gym? What would it look like for you to seek the welfare, the shalom of this city that you have been brought? What would it look like to pray for the city on its behalf? Because in the shalom of Greenwich, of Darien, of Westchester, of Fairfield County, of Westchester counties, of Connecticut, of New York, of America, that's where we too will find our shalom. So I'd love to invite you to just take a couple of moments to just thoughtfully pray on those couple of questions, and then we're going to move to the communion table together.